Well, this is a long one, it seems. Posted Friday, August the 6th or 9th, 2019. 2097 is the number and name of the anachronism, subtitled The Performance. One of these things is not like the other, she sings, putting on her mismatched pair of socks, which she thoroughly believes, thanks to the fact that she now remembers, just recently been informed of the fact that she had recently performed a few spontaneous acts that could quite well be interpreted, or as she tends to think in such cases, could be debated as being questionable, such as the old monogamy argument, or, as he would put it, the old marriage in, appropriate quantity. As her guilt built within, she knew this was why she, obsessive-compulsive to the core, had been dealt the pair of mismatched socks to begin with. He was the launderer, after all. To her credit, she most often did the cooking and the dog walking, while the two of them equally shared the house cleaning, although even she knew that the word equally, if not also the word shared, did not fit justly into the vicinity of reality. As for the mismatched sock, and whether this was yet another example of his passive-aggressive method of seeking revenge, which he would always grinningly call justice, to which she'd always zing him back with the cliche, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Well, although it was next to impossible for her to spend her entire workday wearing socks that didn't match, in this particular case, not even slightly, she could not help but to titter a bit at the pair of unmatched revenge. One might say she even glowed with obvious joy during and after her initial reaction to his joke, during which there may have been a swear word or two involved. It was, after all, he who, just like every weekday morning, handed her the paper bag filled with her dinner and her pair, or unpair today, of work socks, as she walked out the door and into the day. And even though it was a funny little titter, it was also the same sound she always made when she laughed in earnest, meaning it was her real laugh. Something her 3 or at times 4 best friends would heartily verify, quite often along with some untittering, more quantifiably genuine laughter of their own. This wacky laugh of hers, which to her was not wacky at all, of course, quite often had a way to make strangers, new acquaintances, quite uncomfortable upon hearing the first few times, especially when it was unusually protracted or multiply repeated within a relatively short duration. Nevertheless, the tittering had ironically enough been a significant ingredient of the circumstances of their very first meeting, the meeting of her and him, that is. It was in that cliche of environs in which we certainly assume a fairly high percentage of lovebirds wind up, well, being lovebirds, with varying durations ranging from cliched, she really loved that word, she thought, singular night, to the very long-term engagement, a word which had her tittering again for a moment. And these thoughts were, in actuality, buzzing around in her skull at the time. She just could not release her mind of a bombardment of happy and nostalgic thoughts from the past 20 years that had taken residence in the attic, his phrase, for a few days now. For in a matter of days, roughly equivalent to the days in which her mind had been thusly preoccupied, the two of them would see the 20th anniversary of the night in which they had their wedding vows. which transpired deep in the entrails of a gorgeous cathedral in the middle of nowhere, Vermont, where she was now picturing, as if a cameraman in the cathedral on that very day, the two of them and the officiary standing the deepest within in front of a modest-sized group of their respective family members and close friends. They had, in fact, met only a few weeks before in a bar that was somewhat local to the two of them, although neither had ever been there before and had certainly never met the other until that day when she barely noticed, at first, a rather nervous gentleman take an extended amount of time seating himself at the empty, except for her and now his long bar upon the top of a bar stool that was, with respect to her, directly to her right. She had already given the bartender her card to close out the tab, and the last remnant of the order for which she was paying sat at her right elbow, practically filled, since it had only as of yet been given a singular sip. The man at last situated his butt somewhat solidly upon the tall stool when she felt him tap at her, and rather loudly, upon her elbow. Or she thought he tapped. She quickly turned her head to the right, head downward, eyes upward, aiming directly into his, and with a clear, ready to tell this into the night rapscallion what look, which had become a rote performance, which generally began with how happily single she presently was, how much, in fact, that she absolutely adored being single, and which ended with something akin to, "So you might as well give it up, fella." But just as she caught his eyes in the gaze of hers, she understood that this guy had decidedly not been vying for attention, at least not in any way that seemed she had suddenly deemed inappropriate. And she was very perceptive. She was momentarily mystified and remained frozen in that missile precise gaze of hers that for what would have been, from any objective perspective within the nearly empty bar, an awkwardly long time. So rather than pay attention to what he had actually done, which was an extension of the awkward duration of situating himself on the bar stool, except but slightly more potentially catastrophic, which was that he had managed to tip her last drink, which had been a tumbler almost entirely filled with Bloody Mary, which was and still is. She is one of those rare folks who understand the drink to be undeniably non-specific with respect to the appropriate time of day to imbibe her favorite cocktail. And it had to be admitted, she got a very specific kind of joy from ordering one at 1, or even past 1, right before a local bar or restaurant stopped serving any alcoholic instilled drinks whatsoever, the law being the law, as it were. So not only was the thin sleeve of her blouse drenched by the veritable blood of Mary, but so was the general vicinity, or more truthfully, the entire vicinity of the section of the same thin blouse which covered her right breast. In fact, there were even a few splashes that made their individual ways upon her slightly rounded and completely unadulterated, until now, of course, but in particular without even a swath of makeup, and by now giddily flushed cheeks, glimmering red splotches on both the left and the right, thanks to her swift turn of intended reproach. This happened in a much more drawn-out time in the minds of the both of them than could have literally been possible, as they could later and often recount it. It would be told in the company of friends, perhaps after a long and hearty meal or in front of the Christmas tree. It would sometimes occur as what would seem an anecdotal segue from whatever came directly before it, or as an almost comedically staged performance that would seem to spontaneously erupt. And their audience was always rapt, amused, admiring, and envious, often all at once, even though most had already heard it, had seen its half reenactment, half fantastical performance piece at least once or twice before. This bit would also occur routinely with no one else present, just the two of them, sometimes in quite the intimate manner, and just as often at a seemingly random time, as it happened at times, that might seem less arbitrary, such as after watching a particularly sweet sitcom at home, on the living room sofa together, or while driving, which would most often occur with her behind the wheel, him in the passenger seat, unless they were in a group of some sort, in which case he would usually drive while she sat in the middle of the back seat, the life of the party, as always. Their somewhat dinged Pontiac either up or down the Pacific Coast Highway. On some occasions, their performance came out in sultry whispers filled with innuendo as they were lying side by side at bedtime, both of them in an almost dream state, trance, directly before the two fell deeply and almost simultaneously into sleep for the night. Or it might begin in the same type of dream state before they decidedly did not fall asleep for the night, after the lights were finally turned out. Sometimes it began early of a morning, one of them trying to make the other, so as not to have either of them oversleep for work or whatever the day held in store for each of them, whether it would transpire with together or whether they'd go their separate ways for the duration of the day. This routine of theirs might take on new and exaggerated changes or witty, more subtle ones, but it always ended in that infinitely envied way wherein not one soul would have ever disbelieved that a fragment of what they told were the least bit untrue, and whether cognizant or not by either member of the dynamic duo, spoke in absolute unison with, and it was love at first sight, to which she would add that she had never even paused, not for one tiny moment, until well after they walked out of that bar, emptying it together, newly emboldened, their insides buzzing with the giddiness of youth, to see the mess he and the Bloody Mary had made of her and her blouse, after which he'd add something like how he had been such an awkward fellow until he had met her. Quite a long story.